Forced to marry the most feared widow in the territory, he expected the worst. The judge set his pen down on the desk and looked at me the way a man looks at a horse he's about to sell to someone he doesn't entirely trust. He said, "You understand what you're agreeing to, Cal?" And I said I did, which was a lie, because nobody in the territory fully understood Delia Crane, and the ones who thought they did had mostly ended up with less than they started with. That was a Thursday in late October, 1882. I remember because the stove in the judge's office had gone cold and nobody had bothered to relight it, and I could see my own breath when I spoke. That detail seems small, but it stuck. The cold and the pen scratching the paper, and outside the window the cottonwoods already stripped bare, all their yellow leaves gone somewhere south. The territory does that to a thing, strips it down whether it's ready or not. I want to go back a little before I get to Delia. I want you to understand what I was before, so you understand what that marriage was walking into. My name is Cal Doer. I was 38 years old that October, which in that country felt closer to 50. I'd been running a small freight operation out of Morrow's Crossing for 6 years, 2 wagons, 3 mules I named after the apostles, a hired man named Tuck who drank more than he worked but could fix an axle in the dark. I was not a rich man. I was not a famous man. I was the kind of man people remember only when they need something hauled. You know the type, or maybe you are the type. The man who keeps things moving. The man whose name you forget until your wagon breaks down on a Thursday in a cold October, and then you remember it real fast. I had been married once before. Her name was Alma. She died of fever in the summer of 1879, her and the child both, a boy we'd only had 6 weeks. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it so you understand that by 1882 I had made a kind of arrangement with myself. I was going to be useful. I was going to keep things running. I was not going to love anything that could be taken away in an August heat with a fever and a name I hadn't finished deciding on. That's who was walking into the judge's office. That's who was agreeing to marry Delia Crane. Now I'll tell you who she was, or who the territory said she was, which at that point in my knowledge were the same thing. Delia Crane was 41 years old. She had been widowed twice. The first husband, a cattle agent named Prescott, had died of a heart failure at supper, which the territory accepted because it happened in front of 6 witnesses. The second, a land speculator named Crane, whose name she kept because she said Prescott sounded like a sneeze, had fallen from a horse and broken his neck crossing a creek on his own property. The territory accepted that one too because there was no evidence of anything else, but the territory also talked. The territory always talks. What the talk said was this: Delia Crane had run both her husbands into the ground through sheer force of will, and the ground had simply been the most efficient solution. She was hard. She was cold. She had a tongue like a drawn knife and a temper she didn't bother to conceal. She ran the Crane Ranch, 4,000 acres of shortgrass range south of the Morrow's Crossing Road, with 2 Mexican ranch hands, one old cowboy named Gus who'd been there since before the first husband, and a 12-year-old boy named Pete, who was her late sister's son, and who she'd taken in when her sister died. Nobody helped her because nobody wanted to be near her. The ranch was producing, but barely. She needed a man who could run cattle and haul freight and fix what broke and stand between her and the 3 or 4 parties who had decided, now that she was twice widowed and alone, that her land was available for taking. Why did she need to marry to accomplish that? That's what I asked the judge. He gave me a look. He said the territory in 1882 was not a place a single woman could hold 4,000 acres against men with lawyers, and her lawyers had told her to remarry before the year was out, or she would lose the southern parcel to a water rights claim that would gut the entire ranch inside 2 years. She needed a husband with a name attached to the deed. She needed someone capable. She didn't need someone she had to love. That last part was the judge's way of making it sound appealing to me. What I got out of it was clear enough. My freight operation was 3 payments behind on its loan at the Morrow's Crossing Bank, and the man who held that note was named Aldrich, and Aldrich had made it plain the previous week that he would rather own my mules and wagons than see me catch up. Delia Crane's ranch had a barn, 30 cattle, a functioning well, and no debt. The arrangement was, I'd put my name on her deed, she'd pay off my loan, we'd both keep what we had and not interfere with each other more than necessary. That was the deal. That was what I agreed to in the cold judge's office while my breath made small clouds and the cottonwoods stood bare outside. I expected the worst. I'll tell you about the first morning. I drove out to the ranch the day after we signed the papers. I had 1 crate of tools, my saddle, a bag of clothes, and the 3 mules. Tuck, my hired man, had elected to stay in town and find other work, which told me something about how the news of my marriage had been received in Morrow's Crossing. I drove alone. The road south from town cuts through a long flat section of range before the land breaks up into draws and cedar ridges, and that morning there was frost on the grass that hadn't burned off yet, and the sky was the color of tin. I was not cheerful. The house sat at the end of a track through a stand of cottonwoods, big old ones, older than anything else on the property, the only thing that had shade to give. The house itself was stone on the first floor, wood frame above, a covered porch running the whole front length. Good house, I thought, better than I expected. Then I noticed that every single window shade was pulled down, and I thought, right. I unloaded the mules and turned them into the corral and carried my crate and bag to the porch and stood there a moment. The door opened before I knocked. She was taller than I'd been told, maybe 5'8", which in a woman in 1882 was notable. Dark hair, mostly gray now, pulled straight back, not a strand loose. A face that had been handsome once and had not gone soft since, angular, the jaw you noticed first. She was wearing a plain dark dress and an apron, and she had a dish towel in one hand. And she looked at me with eyes the color of creek water in winter, that gray-green that doesn't invite warmth. She said, "You're late." I said, "By what measure?" She looked at me a moment. Then she stepped back from the door and went back to whatever she'd been doing in the kitchen. I took that as permission to come inside. The boy Pete was at the kitchen table eating. He was small for 12, dark-haired like his aunt, with eyes that watched everything and said nothing. He glanced at me and then went back to his bowl. Gus, the old cowboy, was at the back door with his hat in his hand, waiting to be told something. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has survived 2 previous iterations of this situation and hopes, not entirely confidently, to survive a third. Delia set a plate on the table and said, "Sit down if you're going to eat." There was no chair indicated. I pulled out the one across from Pete and sat. She set coffee in front of me without asking if I wanted it. It was hot and strong and tasted like it had been on the fire since before the frost burned off, which I appreciated. I drank half of it before she sat down at the end of the table with her own cup. She didn't eat. She had a piece of paper in front of her, which she slid toward me without ceremony. She said, "The south fence on the lower pasture has 3 posts rotted out. The windmill on the east tank is missing a vane and won't turn in a light wind. The barn roof has 2 sections that'll go by spring if they don't get attention. The north field has a ditch problem that's been backing up since September. Those are the first things. There is a longer list." I looked at the paper. It was a list in a clear, precise hand, numbered with notes beside each item. Not a woman who wasted a word, written or otherwise. I said, "What's the ditch problem exactly?" She said, "Inlet's blocked. The field floods when it rains, which it will do in November." I said, "I can look at it this afternoon." She said, "I know you can. That's why you're here." It wasn't said cruelly. It was said the way you'd state that water runs downhill, a fact, not an insult. But I sat with it a moment and felt the shape of the thing I'd agreed to. The most feared widow in the territory looked at me like a tool she'd needed and acquired, and I supposed that was about right. I finished the coffee. I asked Gus to show me the fence line. We went out. That was the first morning. The weeks moved in a shape I came to understand. She gave me work and I did it. She was not wasteful with praise, but she was accurate. When I fixed the windmill, which involved going up 20 feet on an iron ladder in a cold wind, not something I enjoyed, she came out, watched it turn through a full rotation and said, "Good." That was all. But it was not nothing. Good from Delia Crane, I came to learn, was roughly equivalent to a lengthy speech from anyone else. The boy Pete began to follow me around by the third day. He didn't talk much, but he was useful. He knew where every tool on the property was stored, and he'd hand you the right one before you asked. Smart kid, careful. I asked him once how long he'd been on the ranch, and he said 2 years. I asked if he liked it, and he thought about it seriously before he said, "I like Aunt D. The rest is all right." I found out on the 4th day about the men who wanted the land. There were 2 main ones. The first was a man named Birch, who ran cattle on the range west of Delia's south pasture, and who had been claiming a water easement on the creek that ran through the lower field for the better part of 2 years. He had a lawyer in the territorial capital and a county judge he'd paid well. The second was a man named Holt, a land speculator of the same species as her late second husband, which may have been part of why she disliked him with a particular intensity. Holt wanted the north acreage specifically. There was a narrow canyon at its edge that a rail spur could theoretically run through, which would make that land worth 5 times what it currently was. Neither of these men had physically threatened her, but both had made clear in the language of that country that a woman alone could not hold what she had, and both were patient in the way that men are patient when they believe time is working for them. My name on the deed changed the calculation, but only somewhat. What would change it more was my presence, visible, regular, the kind that made plain that the land was occupied by a man who intended to stay. I understood this without being told. I began making myself known. I drove the wagon into Morrow's Crossing twice a week, kept the freight work going on smaller hauls, talked to people at the feed store and the livery and the 2 saloons in the way that men talk when they want certain things to be known without being said outright. I was Cal Doer. I was at the Crane Ranch. I was not going anywhere. 3 weeks in, Birch sent a man to ride the creek line with a surveyor's stake. I rode out and met him at the property marker and told him the stake went back with him or it stayed where he left it, and we'd see what a judge said about that. The man looked at me for a while. Then he took the stake and rode back the way he came. I don't tell that story to sound large. I tell it because later that evening Gus mentioned it to Delia at supper, and she looked at me across the table and gave me a nod that was so small I might have invented it. But I don't think I did. The sleeping arrangement, which I should address plainly. There was a room off the back of the house that had been used for storage, and I cleared it out the first week and put my bedroll there. Delia slept in the room at the end of the hall. We did not discuss it. It was a business arrangement, and we both behaved accordingly, which is to say with a kind of scrupulous distance. She moved through the house in the morning at 5:30, coffee on by 5:40, without noise, without ceremony. I came in for meals, went back to work. We talked about the ranch. We talked about the boy, occasionally, in the careful way of 2 people who both care about something without having agreed to admit it. There were things I noticed about her that had nothing to do with business, and I noticed them with the careful inattention of a man who has made an arrangement with himself about what he's going to feel. She read at night. I could see the lamplight under her door. She read for a long time, which meant she slept later than her body wanted to in the mornings, and still she was always up first. She had a way with the horses, not gentle exactly, but sure, and they came to her in the corral without hesitation. She had strong hands, the hands of a person who had worked the land for 20 years, and she used them with a precision I found myself watching sometimes when I shouldn't have been. She had a laugh I only heard twice in that first month, both times from outside, both times with Pete, who could apparently extract something from her that nobody else managed to. It was a real laugh, not a polite one. It startled me both times like a bird going up from grass you thought was empty. I noticed these things and put them away somewhere I wasn't looking. The trouble came in November, as trouble tends to. It came in the form of a letter from the territorial court, which arrived on a Tuesday with the afternoon mail. Delia opened it at the kitchen table and read it without expression. Then she set it down and got up and stood at the window for a moment looking out at the yard. Pete was outside splitting kindling. Gus was in the barn. I was the only other person in the room. She said Birch filed his easement claim. The hearing is January 9th. I said in town. She said capital. It's a territorial court matter now. They pulled it up from the county. I said that's Holt's doing. He's got friends in the capital. She didn't answer that. She was still looking out the window. I said we need to respond. Do you have an attorney? She said I had one. He left the territory in September. I said I'll go to town tomorrow. There's a man named Fitch who does land work. I'll talk to him. She said Fitch works for Birch on his East Range grazing leases. I said then we'll find someone else. She turned from the window. She said, Mr. Dower. I said Cal. She looked at me for a moment. Nobody had said my name like that in a while, like it was a word worth pronouncing fully. She said, I want you to understand something. I have been fighting these men for 2 years. I have done everything correctly. I have filed every paper. I have stayed inside the law. They have more money than I have. They have more connections than I have. And unless something changes materially in the next 60 days, they are going to take the southern parcel regardless of what legal instruments my late husband left behind. I am telling you this because you deserve to know what you're standing in the middle of. I said, I know what I'm standing in the middle of. She said, do you? I said, I've been watching Birch and Holt since I got here. Birch wants the water. Holt wants the canyon access. Neither one of them actually needs what they're claiming. They want you gone, specifically, because you're a woman who won't be moved and that offends them. That's what I'm standing in the middle of. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she sat back down at the table and picked up the letter again. She said, Fitch or no Fitch, we need a man who can argue the creek survey. The original survey from 1871 puts the creek boundary 20 feet further east than Birch is claiming. I said, who did the original survey? She said, a man named Aldous out of Fort Laramie. He's dead now. I said, his records won't be. She looked up. I said, his survey records. Every surveyor in the territory filed copies with the land office in the capital. If Aldous did the work in 1871, his field notes are still in that office. We get those notes. We have the eastern boundary on paper in the original surveyor's hand, and Birch's claim falls apart. She was quiet, then she said, how do you know that? I said, I hauled building materials for the Capital Land Office for 3 years. I learned more than I meant to about how they file things. She stared at me. Not the way she usually looked at me, assessing, practical, measuring what use I was. This was different. This was the look of a person who has been fighting alone for long enough that they have stopped expecting help, and someone just offered it anyway. She said quietly, that could work. I said, it'll work. I'll go to the capital next week if the weather holds. She said, I'll go with you. I looked at her. She said, it's my land. I'm not staying home. I said I wasn't going to suggest it. Something shifted in her face, so small I couldn't have named it. Then she stood up and put the letter in the box on the shelf where she kept important papers and said, supper at 6. The boy needs help with his arithmetic after if you have time. I said I had time. We rode to the capital the following Monday. The two of us in the wagon with Gus left in charge of the ranch and Pete left in charge of Gus, which we both felt was a more reliable arrangement. The road to the capital was 2 days' travel, which meant a night in the Trail Inn at Coulter's Crossing. That night at the inn, we ate at a long table with 6 other travelers, and Delia talked with the ease of a person who had learned to be watchful in public company without showing it. She was not warm exactly, but she was not what the territory said she was either. She listened. She asked questions that were actually interested in the answers. A cattle rancher from the Panhandle spent 40 minutes telling her about a grass disease he'd been managing, and she knew enough to ask him the one question that made him light up, and I watched him realize for the first time in that conversation that she understood what he was talking about. He went to bed looking like he'd been given a gift. I said to her afterward, when we were the last 2 at the table, "You know a lot about grass disease." She said, "I've been running a cattle ranch for 12 years. I said, "The territory doesn't seem to know that about you." She looked at me sideways. Then she said, "What does the territory know about you?" I said, "That I'm the man who hauls things." She said, "And?" I said, "That's about all." She said, "You went up that windmill in a 40-mile wind and you fixed it in 20 minutes and you never said a word about it. You rode out to Birch's Man alone. You knew about the survey records when I'd been working that problem for 8 months." She paused. "The territory doesn't know what it has." I didn't say anything. I didn't trust what I'd say. She picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. She said, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it plain." I said, "All right." She said, "I didn't want to remarry. I want to be clear about that. I did it because my attorneys told me it was the only way to hold the land, and I chose you because Aldrich at the bank told me you were reliable and you were in trouble, and I thought those 2 things together might mean you'd stay." She stopped. She had her hands flat on the table, the way she did when she was going to say something she'd decided on. She said, "I was prepared for it to be a transaction. I expected something manageable. I did not expect you." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means you show up. It means you know things I need you to know. It means Pete follows you around like a dog and Gus trusts you, and neither of those men trusts easily. It means I have not once, had to wonder whether you were going to do what you said you'd do." I was quiet. There was a lamp burning low at the end of the table, and outside the window the dark was complete. No moon, and it was very still. I said, "Delia." She said, "I know. It's a strange thing to say to someone you married on paper." I said, "I don't think it is." She looked at me. I said, "I think it's the right thing to say to someone who's earned it." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at her hands on the table and I watched her jaw work once, the way a person's does when they're holding something. Then she looked up again and she said, quietly and level, "I would like it not to be only on paper." I let that sit. Then I said, "That can be arranged." She made a sound, not the laugh I'd heard outside with Pete, but something smaller, wry, complicated. She said, "You sound like the judge." I said, "It's a good phrase, covers a lot of territory." She almost smiled. I had not seen that before. We sat there a while longer in the low lamplight at the table at Coulter's Crossing with the cold outside and the dark, and it was the best I'd felt since Alma. I won't say more than that. I don't need to. If you know, you know. The Capitol Land Office was on a side street off the main square, a narrow building with a clerk who looked like he hadn't left the building since it was constructed. Delia had the original deed documents in a leather satchel she'd carried from the ranch, the deed itself, and the water rights filings, and the boundary descriptions from the 1876 title. I explained what we needed. The clerk knew the Aldis survey files. He went back into the stacks without much fuss, and came out 20 minutes later with a bound ledger and 3 rolled papers. The field notes were there. The original creek boundary was notated in Aldis's own hand, in the 1871 survey, with compass readings and chain measurements, showing the eastern line of the Crane property ran along a cedar ridge that was, by any fair measurement, 23 feet east of the marker birches people had planted. Delia stood beside me at the clerk's counter and looked at those field notes, and I could see her reading them with the close attention of someone who has been waiting a long time to find the thing that settles something. She went through them twice. Then she looked up at me with those creekwater eyes. She said, "This is it." I said, "Get him to make certified copies, 3 sets." She looked at the clerk. He was already pulling out the copy paper. We found an attorney that afternoon, not Fitch, but a man named Rosser who had argued 3 territorial land cases and won 2 of them, and who listened to us for an hour with the field notes spread out on his desk, and said he could have a response filed before Christmas. He charged us $200, which Delia paid without flinching from the fold of bills she kept in the inside pocket of her coat. On the way out of Rosser's office on the steps, she stopped and put her hand on my arm. Just her hand on my arm, that was all. Her fingers were cold from the November air. She said, "Thank you." I said, "It's my land too now." She gave me a look, not hard, not appraising, something warmer. She said, "Yes, it is." We walked back to the wagon in the thin late afternoon sun, and I matched my pace to hers, and neither of us said anything else, which felt like exactly enough. I want to tell you about December. December on the Crane Ranch is a particular kind of quiet. The cattle are in the lower pastures near the hay storage, and they want seeing to in the mornings. And there's a wind that comes off the ridge to the north that turns everything metal to something you don't want to touch with bare hands. And the sky goes that low gray by mid-afternoon that makes evening feel like it starts at 3. It is not a hospitable month. I have known men who went a little mad by Christmas in country like that. But that December, I was not one of them. What I was in a different kind of country altogether. I won't tell you every detail because some things are between 2 people and the space they inhabit together. I will tell you this. There is a way that a person changes when they stop holding themselves back from something. Delia Crane had been holding herself back for years, maybe her whole adult life, maybe since before the first husband, maybe since she was a girl who learned that the world did not intend to make things easy for her and adjusted accordingly. I recognized the shape of it because I had my own version of it, and I had been living inside mine for 3 years since Alma and the boy died. What I mean is that we understood each other in a way that didn't require a lot of explaining. She told me about Prescott, the first husband, one evening in December when we were sitting by the fire after Pete had gone to bed. Not the version the territory told. Her version, which was that he had been a decent man but a small one, a man who loved her but loved his comfort more, and who had not in the end been able to stand being outworked by his own wife without letting it curdle him. He hadn't been murdered. He'd had a heart attack at supper, as reported. But she had, she said, already been grieving him for 2 years before he died, which was its own kind of long. I told her about Alma. I hadn't told anyone about Alma in 3 years. I told her about the summer and the fever and the boy with no name, and I told her about the arrangement I'd made with myself afterward, and she listened the whole way through without saying anything until I was done. Then she said, "That's a hard thing to carry alone." I said I got used to it. She said, "I know, that's the problem with it." She had her hand on my forearm, her thumb moving once across the back of my wrist. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the kind of thing a person does when they want you to know they've heard you. But I felt it all the way down to somewhere I'd thought was closed off, and I sat with that a moment and didn't try to close it again. Christmas came and went in the practical way of a working ranch. Delia cooked. I fixed the section of barn roof that had been waiting since October. Gus produced a bottle of whiskey from somewhere, and we all had some, even Delia, who drank hers with the deliberate seriousness of a person performing a ritual. Pete got a new hat, which he needed, and a pocket knife, which he'd asked for, and which Delia produced from inside her coat on Christmas morning with the air of someone who has been waiting for the right moment. He looked at it a long time, turning it in his hands. Then he said, "Thank you, Aunt Dee," she said, Don't cut yourself, which was as much tenderness as she usually showed in front of witnesses. That evening after supper, when the boy was in bed and Gus had gone to his bunk in the barn, she and I sat by the fire again. The wind was working at the north window. She had a book in her lap, but she wasn't reading it. She said, "What did you tell the town when people ask about this?" I said, "I tell them we're running the ranch." She said, "And what do you tell them about us?" I said, "That we're doing fine." She looked at me, she said, "Is that true?" I said, "From where I'm sitting, it's one of the truest things I've ever said." She looked at me a while longer. Then she set the book on the table and turned to face me, and she said, with the same plainness she brought to everything, "I want you to know that I see you. I want you to know that what you've done here, not just the work, though Lord knows that's been considerable, but the way you've been, with Pete, with the men. The way you stood at that property marker with Birch's man. The way you walked into that land office like it was your right to be there, which it was." She stopped, took a breath, said, "Nobody has stood beside me like that. Not the first husband, not the second. And I need you to know I don't take it for granted." I didn't say anything for a moment. The fire crackled. The wind pushed at the window. I said, "Delia." She said, "I know you didn't come here expecting much." I said, "No, I didn't." She said, "Are you disappointed?" I said, "I am about the furthest thing from disappointed a man can be." She reached over and took my hand. Her grip was firm, always was. That was just how she was, and she held it with both of hers and looked at the fire. We sat like that a long time. The lamp burned down and the fire burned down and the wind eventually quieted, and outside the window the night was clear and cold and full of stars. The kind of stars you only see in high country in December, more of them than you can account for. I think about that evening more than almost anything. January 9th came. The territorial hearing was held in a courtroom that smelled of pine resin and too many men in wool coats. Delia and I sat at the respondent's table with Roser, who had the Aldous Field notes in 3 certified copies in a leather portfolio. Birch sat across the room with his lawyer, and 2 other men I recognized as county officials who owed him money or favors. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Roser put the original survey on the record. He put the field notes on the record. He put the compass bearings and the chain measurements on the record, and he walked the judge through exactly where Aldous' 1871 eastern boundary ran, which was 23 feet east of the stake Birch's men had planted, and he asked the judge to compare that measurement to the marker on the current county map, which had been revised. He noted carefully, in 1880, 2 years after Prescott's death and 2 months after Delia began resisting Birch's easement claims. The judge looked at the 2 maps side by side for a long time. Birch's attorney argued for a while. Then he stopped arguing and started negotiating, which is what attorneys do when they know they've lost. The judge called a recess. In the hall, Delia stood beside me, and we didn't speak. Her shoulder was against my arm. She was looking at nothing, or at something in the middle distance that only she could see. I could feel the tension in her, not fear. That wasn't it. More like a person who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and is not yet ready to believe they can put it down. The judge came back. He ruled in our favor on the eastern boundary. He dismissed the easement claim. He noted the 1880 map revision in the record and suggested the county surveyor's office might want to review several other revisions made in that period, which was his way of doing something without being seen to do it. Birch left the courtroom without looking at us. His attorney shook Roser's hand with the expression of a man who had been paid enough not to feel bad about losing. We walked out into a January afternoon that was cold and bright, the kind of light that hurts your eyes coming out of a building. Delia stood on the courthouse steps with her leather satchel and the wind moving her hair, not many strands. She kept it pulled back, but a few, and she turned to me. She said, "The whole matter won't be settled by a survey." I said no, that one we settled by staying. She looked at me. I said, he's a speculator. He needs the canyon access if the railroad comes through. If it doesn't come through, the land's not worth enough for him to fight for. We stay, we work the land, we make ourselves unmovable, and either the railroad doesn't come through or it does, and we deal with that when it happens. He'll move on to something easier. She said that could take years. I said, I'm not going anywhere. She looked at me for a moment with the winter light on her face, and I could see her deciding something, the way she decided things all the way, without reservation. She said, no, neither am I. She put her hand through my arm and we went down the courthouse steps together and across the square to where the wagon was tied, and the cold was considerable, and the sky was enormous the way it gets in that country when there's nothing between you and the whole length of it. And I felt, walking beside that woman, like a man who had his feet on ground that was his. Here is where I've landed, if you want to know. Delia and I have been married 4 years now, real married, not on paper married, and the ranch runs the way a good operation runs, not easy, not without trouble but properly. We lost the North Hay field to a wet spring and recovered it by fall. We brought in 6 more head last summer and they've done well. Tuck came back, which is to say he showed up at the gate one morning with his hat in his hand and a 6-month sobriety that has so far been holding. Delia looked at him for a long moment and then told him the axle on the south wagon needed attention, which was her way of saying yes. Pete turned 16 last spring. He can rope better than Gus and doesn't know it yet, or pretends not to, which is its own kind of intelligence. He calls me Cal now instead of Mr. Dower, which happened without ceremony one morning at breakfast about 1.5 years ago, and I noticed it and said nothing and let it stand. Holt moved on to a water scheme in the lower territory, as I'd thought he would. Birch died of something natural, or so the report said, without anyone having to do anything about him. The territory still tells the story about Delia. Still says she's the woman who buried 2 husbands and would probably bury a 3rd. I've heard it told twice at the Morrow's Crossing feed store while I was standing there, which I take as evidence that I am still not the most memorable man in any given room, and which I have entirely stopped minding. What I know is this. I came to that ranch expecting nothing, and I found a woman who saw what I was, not what the territory said about me. Not what Aldrich thought I was when he held my loan note. Not what I thought I was after Alma, that arrangement I'd made with myself about being useful and expecting nothing back. She looked at me across that table the first morning with her list of what needed doing, and I didn't know it yet, but she'd already taken my measure and found it sufficient. That's not a small thing. For a man who'd spent 3 years being sufficient for no one who mattered, it was not a small thing at all. She is asleep right now, in that room at the end of the hall that is not just her room anymore, and the lamp is out, and the ranch is quiet the way it gets at 3 in the morning in winter. Nothing moving, the cold doing its work outside, the stars doing theirs. I have work tomorrow, there is always work. The ditch on the north field needs attention again, they always need attention again, and the mules need their feet looked at, and there's a fence section on the ridge that I've been meaning to get to since October. I'll get to it tomorrow, or the day after. It'll be there. I'm not going anywhere. Neither is she. That's the whole thing, really. That's what I wanted to tell you. A man who expected the worst and got the opposite, from a woman the territory had entirely wrong. From a woman who knew exactly what she was doing when she said she'd take a chance on a broken-down freight hauler who knew about survey records and could fix a windmill in the wind. She saw me and she stayed. That's enough, that's more than enough. The lamps burned down, time to sleep.